The pen moved across the legal form, and Clare Weston kept her hand perfectly steady. She had made one decision during the drive to the registrar's office. No matter how humiliating this arrangement became, she would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Across the desk, Julian Far had already signed his name. He sat quietly in a faded canvas jacket, an old oil mark visible near the cuff, and worn boots that looked more suited to a boatyard than a marriage ceremony. He didn't seem nervous, embarrassed, or even interested in explaining himself. He simply waited. The registrar cleared his throat and asked whether both of them were entering the marriage freely and without coercion. Clare answered yes. Julian gave a single nod. Outside, phones were already buzzing with financial news, but nobody inside the small office understood the connection. 6 weeks earlier, Clare had been working in Edinburgh when her father, Gordon Weston, suddenly called and ordered her home immediately. The Weston Karen Group, a family business built over 3 generations, was collapsing under failed investments, withdrawn creditors, and a disastrous port acquisition. More than 400 employees depended on the company, and 11 schools relied on its charitable foundation. Gordon told Clare there was only one person willing to restructure the debt, provide a 2-year financial lifeline, and keep the company alive. His name was Julian Far. Then came the condition that left Clare speechless. Julian wanted to marry her. Clare stared at her father, unable to believe that her family's entire future had somehow been reduced to one impossible decision. Her stepmother called it a business arrangement, a simple legal structure designed to protect the family's corporate interests. But Clare knew what it really was: her life being offered as the price of saving everything her family had built. She looked at the photographs on her father's office wall, remembered the employees, the schools, and the legacy her grandparents had created, and finally whispered the only answer she believed she could give: fine. What Clare didn't know was that the quiet, mechanic-like man she was about to marry was nothing like the broke outsider everyone assumed him to be. Julian Far had once controlled billions in investments, but he had deliberately walked away from that world years ago. Now he restored wooden boats, raised his young daughter Pip in a small coastal cottage, and lived as though money meant almost nothing to him. Clare thought she was sacrificing her future to save her family. She had no idea that the man standing beside her had already sacrificed a fortune of his own, and that this strange marriage would soon reveal secrets powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. The marriage lasted barely 11 minutes. With no flowers, no photographs, and no attempt to make the arrangement look romantic. When it was over, Julian simply held the door open for Clare and followed her outside. He drove an old but carefully maintained truck toward Millshore, and the silence between them felt almost stranger than the marriage itself. Clare had expected a powerful businessman surrounded by expensive cars and tailored suits. Instead, Julian looked like a man who spent his days working with his hands. His home was a small converted waterman's cottage near the waterfront, with weathered wood, an unruly garden, and a wind chime made from pieces of river glass. Clare arrived with her suitcase and immediately realized that this was going to be her life now. Before she could process it, a barefoot 8-year-old girl ran onto the porch. Her name was Pip, Julian's daughter, and she greeted Clare with an endless stream of facts about horseshoe crabs and their blue blood. Julian watched his daughter with a barely visible smile, and for the first time Clare noticed a softness beneath his otherwise unreadable expression. The first week passed quietly. Julian woke before Clare, prepared coffee and breakfast, then left for the boatyard where he restored wooden vessels. He returned every afternoon, helped Pip with her homework, cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and spent the evening reading. He never entered Clare's room or forced her into conversations. He gave her distance as naturally as if he understood exactly how uncomfortable she was. Yet the small things began to confuse her. One morning she discovered that a pair of expensive shoes she had damaged were sitting by the door, perfectly repaired. The cracked heels had been fixed, the leather cleaned, and the shoes conditioned. There was no note and no explanation. Pip simply told her, "Dad fixes things. He can't help it." Clare started noticing other details too. Julian spoke little about himself, but one evening she overheard him on the phone discussing financial terminology with a confidence that didn't belong to an ordinary boat restorer. He casually mentioned investment exposure and market positions as though he had spent his entire life inside the financial world. A few days later, she heard him give another instruction: pull the bid. "I want the whole position unwound before Thursday close." Clare froze. The next morning, she searched the financial news and discovered that a major logistics acquisition had unexpectedly stalled. The connection was impossible to ignore. The man she had married to save her family's company was beginning to look less like a struggling mechanic and more like someone who understood the financial world far better than anyone had told her. Claire didn't know who Julian Far really was yet, but she had begun to realize one thing: the worn boots and old truck were hiding something much bigger. Claire could no longer ignore the strange pieces of Julian's life that refused to fit together. During the day, he worked at the Millshore boatyard restoring wooden vessels, coming home with sawdust on his clothes and grease on his hands. At night, however, he sometimes took calls that sounded nothing like the conversations of a boat mechanic. 3 days after the first call, Claire overheard another one while Julian stood outside in the garden. His voice was calm as he gave an instruction to someone on the other end. "Pull the bid. All of it. I want the entire position unwound before Thursday's close. And tell Marcus to hold the Renfield offer. I'm not moving until the counterparty gives us something cleaner." Claire immediately wrote the words down. The next morning, she searched the financial news and found that Renfield Group, a logistics company involved in a heavily discussed North Sea acquisition, had suddenly stalled negotiations. The press called it unexplained hesitation from an unnamed principal. Claire stared at the screen, realizing that Julian's private phone call had somehow predicted the exact event. Before she could investigate further, her own family's situation became desperate. Sterling Holt, the Weston Karen Group's most aggressive competitor, began attacking the weakened company from every direction. Creditors withdrew, the main facility was suspended, and by the afternoon, Gordon Weston admitted that he could no longer see a way forward. Claire spent hours calling lawyers, restructuring advisors, and investment contacts, but every answer was the same: the company was too far gone and the timeline was too short. That evening, she returned to the cottage defeated. Julian noticed immediately but asked no unnecessary questions. Instead, he quietly put the kettle on. Pip came home with another strange fact to share, and soon the three of them were sitting together watching a documentary about deep-sea bioluminescence. Claire barely remembered the program, but she remembered the warmth of that ordinary evening. The next morning, everything changed. An anonymous investment fund registered through a Jersey holding structure had purchased the Weston Karen Group's debt positions from the creditors who had withdrawn. The fund had restructured the debt and granted the company a 2-year operational runway. The paperwork was precise, professionally prepared, and clearly planned before the crisis had fully unfolded. No name appeared anywhere. Claire looked at the empty chair where Julian had eaten breakfast and finally understood that the quiet man in the old truck had something to do with the rescue. She still didn't know how much power he possessed, but she was beginning to suspect that her husband hadn't simply agreed to save her family. He had planned for the possibility that they would need saving long before she ever realized it. The anonymous rescue of the Weston Karen Group left Claire with more questions than answers. She knew someone powerful had stepped in, but Julian continued living exactly as before. He went to the boatyard, came home in his old truck, cooked dinner for Pip, and never once behaved like a man who had just moved millions of dollars to save a major company. Claire's curiosity finally pushed her to attend the Hartley Foundation Gala with him. It was one of Drayton's most prestigious financial events, filled with wealthy investors, executives, and families who had known one another for generations. At the entrance, the attendant looked at Julian's name twice, clearly surprised that someone dressed so simply had been invited. Inside, Claire watched people quietly judge him by his worn-looking blazer and understated appearance. Julian seemed completely unaffected. Then a wealthy businessman named Forum approached him and asked what he did. "Boats," Julian answered. When Forum discovered that Julian restored wooden boats rather than working in marine finance, he made a subtle insult about the staff entrance. Claire immediately stepped in. She calmly reminded Forum that his own investment portfolio had fallen 19% against its benchmark and that he had recently extended his management fees despite the poor performance. The conversation ended quickly, and Forum walked away embarrassed. Julian looked at Claire and quietly told her that she didn't have to defend him. She answered, "I know. That's why I did it." On the drive home, Claire apologized for taking so long to understand what was happening around her. Julian simply told her that she had still chosen to stand beside him. That night, Claire finally decided to investigate him properly. She spent hours searching through financial archives and old industry reports. What she discovered left her staring at the screen in disbelief. 11 years earlier, Julian Far had been the founding managing partner of Far Capital, a private equity firm specializing in investments, venture capital, and distressed debt. At its peak, the firm had managed more than $4 billion in assets and had earned a reputation for producing exceptional returns. But then Julian had deliberately dissolved the entire firm. He hadn't gone bankrupt. He hadn't failed. He had settled every investor, closed everything properly, and simply disappeared from the financial world. Claire kept scrolling through old reports until she found the number that made her stop. Julian's personal fortune had remained enormous. The man she had been calling a mechanic had once controlled billions and apparently still did. Yet instead of living in a mansion surrounded by luxury, he had chosen a small cottage, a boatyard, and a quiet life with his daughter. Claire closed her laptop and sat in silence. For the first time, she realized that she hadn't married a broke mechanic to save her family. She had married a billionaire who had deliberately chosen to live like an ordinary man. Claire could not stop thinking about what she had discovered. The man sleeping in the small cottage beside her had once been one of the most powerful figures in the financial world. Yet he had chosen to spend his days repairing wooden boats and raising Pip far away from the attention of investors and journalists. The more Claire researched, the more she realized that Julian's disappearance from the industry had not been caused by failure. 11 years earlier, he had deliberately shut down Far Capital after a serious problem involving his former business partner. The partner had secretly made unauthorized trades in a client's account while trying to recover personal investment losses. If those trades had become public, the consequences could have destroyed the entire firm and harmed innocent investors. Julian had personally used his own capital to cover the exposure, reported the activity internally, protected the firm's investors and employees, and then began an orderly dissolution of the company. He left no unpaid investors and no unfinished obligations. But there was another reason he had walked away. Around the same period, Julian's wife became seriously ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and while he was still dealing with the firm's shutdown, he was suddenly forced to become a single father to little Pip. Julian had been holding a billion-dollar fortune in his hands, but none of it could change what was happening to his family. After his wife's death, he finished winding down the company, stepped away from finance, moved to Millshore, and built a quieter life around his daughter. Claire finally understood why Julian never talked about money. He wasn't hiding because he was ashamed of his wealth. He was hiding because he had already discovered that wealth could not give him the things that mattered most. But one question still bothered Claire. Why had a man with billions agreed to marry her? The answer began with her uncle Clifton. Months earlier, Clifton had approached Julian and presented the Weston Group as an investment opportunity. Julian initially refused. Clifton tried again, showing him the company's employment numbers and explaining what would happen to the 11 schools if the business collapsed. He also showed Julian a simple letter from one of the foundation's teachers describing what the funding meant to the children. That ordinary letter changed his mind. Julian agreed to save the company, but he wanted one condition: the marriage. Claire realized that he hadn't chosen her because of her family's wealth or because he needed anything from her. He had expected her to treat the arrangement like a transaction, but instead she had surprised him. She cared about the people affected by the collapse. And slowly, without either of them realizing it, the arrangement had begun turning into something neither had planned. 3 days after Claire learned the truth about Julian, Sterling Holt made his next move. This time, it wasn't aimed directly at the Weston Group's finances. Instead, a coordinated media attack appeared across several financial publications, bringing up old allegations from more than a decade earlier, claims that had already been settled, retracted, and cleared by regulators. Claire read the stories early that morning and immediately realized they were designed to create fear rather than reveal anything new. She looked across the kitchen table at Julian and said, "This isn't the real move. This is noise." Julian agreed. He explained that Norman Briggs, a minor shareholder who owned 7% of the port logistics subsidiary, was under pressure. If Briggs surrendered his position to Holt, Holt could combine the shares with his own and gain enough influence to force a board review. Once that happened, he could potentially damage the company's valuation and acquire the remaining business at a distressed price. Claire understood what Julian was seeing, but this time she didn't wait for him to solve the problem. She went directly to Briggs. His office was on the 14th floor of an aging Central Drayton building, and when she finally got inside, She found a nervous man who clearly understood that someone much more powerful was trying to force his hand. Clare didn't threaten him or offer him money. Instead, she placed the actual numbers in front of him and explained exactly what would happen if he surrendered his shares. She told him that he wasn't a bad man, he was simply being pressured by someone with more leverage. Then she asked him whether he really wanted to be the person who made Holt's plan possible. Briggs studied the numbers for a long time before finally asking what Clare needed from him. She slid the agreement across the desk. "Your signature today," he signed. That evening, Julian's legal team released a detailed response to the media allegations, including old settlement documents, retraction records, and regulatory clearance letters. The accusations collapsed almost immediately. Several publications issued corrections before midnight, and Holt had no meaningful response. When Clare returned home, Julian was waiting at the kitchen table. She told him Briggs had signed. He simply exhaled and said, "Good." Clare sat across from him and realized how much had changed since the day she entered that registrar's office. She had married him because she believed she had no choice. Now she was beginning to understand that the marriage had become something different. Julian had saved her family, but he had also given her the confidence to fight for it herself. And somewhere between repaired shoes, quiet dinners, Pip's endless questions, and the secrets she had uncovered about the man beside her, Clare had stopped seeing Julian as the stranger she was forced to marry. She was starting to see him as the man she wanted to know. Clare finally confronted Julian after discovering the truth about his past. She wanted to know why a man who had once controlled billions had chosen to live quietly in Millshore, restoring old wooden boats instead of running another financial empire. Julian didn't avoid the question. He told her that years earlier, his former business partner had made unauthorized trades while trying to recover personal losses. If the scheme had become public, innocent investors and employees could have been destroyed along with the firm. Julian had used his own money to cover the positions, protected everyone he could, and then deliberately dissolved the company. But his greatest loss came afterward. His wife became seriously ill and died while their daughter Pip was still very young. Julian finished closing the firm, stepped away from finance, and built a simple life around raising his daughter. He admitted that he still had enormous wealth, but most of it was managed passively through Solent Ridge Holdings. He had enough money to live however he wanted, yet he no longer wanted the life that money had created for him. Clare finally asked the question that mattered most: why had he agreed to marry her? Julian explained that her uncle Clifton had approached him months earlier and asked him to save the Weston Karen Group. Julian had refused twice. Then Clifton showed him the company's employment figures and the 11 schools supported by the family foundation. Finally, he showed Julian a letter from a teacher explaining what that funding meant to the children. That simple letter changed his mind. Julian agreed to help because he couldn't ignore the people who would suffer if the company collapsed. As for Clare, he admitted that he had expected her to treat the marriage as nothing more than a contract. Instead, she had surprised him. She cared about the employees, fought for her family, and slowly began seeing the person behind his disguise. Then Clare asked about the repaired shoes she had found during her first week at the cottage. Julian smiled and admitted that fixing them had started as guilt. He knew he had entered her life through an arrangement she never truly wanted, so he fixed the one thing he could. But somewhere along the way, guilt had turned into something else. He looked at her quietly and finally admitted, "Because it was you." Clare realized that the marriage had stopped being a transaction long before either of them had been brave enough to say it. The attack from Sterling Holt had failed. The Weston Karen Group was secure, and Clare had begun building a future that no longer depended on anyone else making decisions for her. 3 months later, the company was stable, the board had been restructured, and the charitable foundation was protected from the business so the 11 schools could continue receiving their funding. Gordon quietly retired, while Julian remained exactly where he wanted to be at the boatyard, working 4 days a week with his hands. Clare often visited him there and watched the strange contrast between the two versions of her husband. She had seen him command an entire financial conference with the confidence of a man who once controlled billions, yet now he could spend an hour carefully replacing a damaged plank on an old wooden boat. One Saturday afternoon, Clare sat in the garden with Pip when the little girl began explaining how hermit crabs changed shells as they grew. Julian came outside carrying 2 cups of tea and sat nearby. After a quiet moment, he told Clare that she could return to Edinburgh if she wanted. She was more than capable of rebuilding her career there. Clare looked around the small cottage, the untamed garden, the river glass wind chime, the half-restored boat, and the child who had somehow become part of her daily life. She knew she could leave, but for the first time, she didn't want to. "I'm staying anyway," she said. Julian was silent for a moment before gently placing his hand over hers. There was no dramatic declaration, no grand gesture, just a quiet touch that said more than either of them needed to explain. Later, Pip appeared with a jar containing a tiny hermit crab she had named Galileo and asked Clare the question that suddenly made everything feel real. "Are you staying?" Clare looked at Pip, then at Julian, and finally at the life she had never planned but had somehow come to love. "Yes," she answered. "I think I live here." Pip accepted the answer immediately and returned to supervising Galileo. That night, after Pip had gone to sleep, Clare stood by the kitchen window thinking about the woman she had been before the marriage, the ambitious professional in Edinburgh who believed her future had to follow a straight, predictable path. Now she understood that sometimes the life you never planned can become the one you truly want. Julian entered the kitchen and asked what she was thinking about. Clare smiled and admitted that she was thinking about how little she had understood when she signed the marriage papers. Julian told her he hadn't understood either. He had believed he was making a sacrifice, but instead he had unknowingly made the best decision of his life. Clare looked directly at him and said, "I didn't choose this at the beginning, but I'm choosing it now." Julian held her gaze and quietly replied, "So am I for the first time." There was no contract between them, no family crisis, no financial arrangement, only two people consciously choosing each other. Later that evening, after Pip had gone to sleep, Clare stood quietly at the kitchen window and watched the dark lane outside. She thought about the woman she had been before Julian entered her life, the woman with a clear career path in Edinburgh, a carefully planned future, and no intention of ending up in a small coastal cottage. She had once believed success meant always moving forward, always becoming more powerful, more accomplished, and more independent. But now she understood that life could change direction without asking permission. Julian appeared in the doorway and noticed the distant look on her face. When he asked what she was thinking about, Clare admitted that she was thinking about how little she had understood when she signed those marriage papers. She had believed she was sacrificing herself to save her family. She had believed Julian was simply a broke mechanic who needed a legal arrangement to help him gain control of the Weston business. She had been wrong about almost everything. Julian told her that he hadn't understood either. At the beginning, he had thought the marriage was another sacrifice, something he could endure for the sake of the employees, the schools, and the people who depended on the company. But somewhere along the way, the arrangement had become real. Clare looked directly at him and reminded him that she had never truly chosen the marriage in the beginning. Then she took a breath and said, "But I'm choosing it now." Julian didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment before quietly saying, "So am I." Clare stepped closer, and for the first time there was no business contract standing between them, no family crisis forcing them together, and no financial reason keeping them under the same roof. They were there because they wanted to be. Outside, the river glass wind chime moved softly in the night air. The half-restored boat waited beside the cottage for another day's work, while Pip slept peacefully upstairs. Clare had entered Julian's life believing she was marrying a poor mechanic to rescue her family. She had eventually discovered that the quiet man beside her had once controlled billions and could have lived in luxury anywhere in the world. Yet he had chosen a small home, his daughter, honest work, and eventually her. And now Clare was making the same choice. She wasn't staying because she owed Julian anything. She wasn't staying because of the Weston Karen Group. She wasn't staying because of money. She was staying because, somewhere between a broken pair of shoes, a little girl's endless questions, and a man who never asked her to become someone else, she had found a life that finally felt like her own. Weeks passed, and the little cottage in Millshore slowly became more than a temporary home. It became a place where Clare no longer felt like a stranger. Pip had stopped treating her like a guest and started treating her like family, filling the house with questions, stories, and strange facts that somehow made even ordinary evenings feel special. Julian continued going to the boatyard, repairing wooden vessels with the same patience he brought to everything else in his life. Clare continued leading the Weston Karen Group, but she no longer measured her future only by titles, money, or achievements. One evening, she stood outside watching Julian work on the half-restored sloop while the river glass chime moved softly in the wind. She thought about the day she had signed the marriage papers. She had believed she was marrying a poor mechanic because her family needed saving. She had never imagined that the quiet man in worn boots was worth billions, had once controlled more than $4 billion in assets, and had deliberately walked away from that world. But the biggest surprise wasn't his fortune. It was the man behind it. Julian had chosen to live simply, protect his daughter, repair broken things, and help people without demanding recognition. Claire finally understood that the marriage had begun as a sacrifice, but it had ended as a choice. She walked toward him, and Julian looked up from the boat. Neither of them needed a grand speech. They had already said everything that mattered. She had chosen him not because he was a billionaire, not because he saved her family's company, and not because she owed him anything. She chose him because of the kindness hidden behind his silence, the patience behind his strength, and the ordinary life they had built together. Julian chose her for the same reason. The woman who once thought she was giving up her future had discovered that she had actually found a new one. And sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with romance. Sometimes they begin with desperation, sacrifice, and two strangers signing a piece of paper without knowing that the person standing across from them will eventually become home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional story. And tell us in the comments, if you were Claire, would you have stayed with Julian after discovering his secret billionaire identity?